Yeah, I'm sitting here backstage at no conf, and I'm sitting with Max Ogden. And yeah, would you like to explain who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a developer from originally from the Portland, Oregon area, so I'm excited that the conference is here this year, and hopefully in the future. There's no better place to party for sure. I'm a developer mostly involved in open data and open source. So I was living here and working at a market research company, and it got really boring. And I started looking for other things to do and found out that a lot of city governments need help relating to developer communities. So every time you drive down the street and your car goes over one of those sensors in the road, that triggers a little signal that goes to City Hall and tells the traffic engineering team that you drove past the signal so that they can better work on traffic flow. Like we we think that that's some crazy complex system, but most of the time it's really antiquated software and technology, and they're trying to collect all these interesting data sets, and I'm trying to make sure that they can release those data sets to people who can do really, you can imagine like different ways to analyze that using modern web technologies. And that's just like kind of one example of taking a data set that the government's collecting and kind of throwing it out there and seeing what people can do just in data visualization. But I started doing that here in Portland, and then now I'm actually in the middle of a fellowship at this place called Code for America that is kind of what I was doing here, which is taking these government data sets and playing with them essentially. And now I'm kind of acting as developer advocate for different cities around the United States and trying to help them come up with patterns on how to get developers excited to help make the cities they live in work better.
Really, it's really cool stuff. I've seen quite a lot of the things you've been doing, and actually, there was one project that made me laugh a lot yesterday. That turned out, I think it was quite a fun project, which turned into something reasonably serious. It was called, I think it was Portland Smells. Would you care to comment on what that project was and how that
Yes.
came up?
So, like 5 years ago now, I was kind of amazed by all of the Google Maps mashups. This is, around the brink of all of the different web mapping things that were coming about. And so I said, hey, I've got some free time. I'm getting into JavaScript, and I started teaching myself the Google Maps API. And I built a wiki that you can add a place to a map. It's just a big collaboratively edited map. Anyone can add a location, and anyone can tag the location. And I themed it around publicly accessible smells. And there were a few hundred different smells that got added. And there were things from a bread factory that would smell like yeast in the middle of the night to the homeless shelter, and people would say it smells horrible, and that got a little bit contentious. And then there were like bakeries and all sorts of random things, that laundry places that smell like laundry, and I didn't think much of it. People would report weird smells like burnt toast in their backyard, and the local government contacted me, and they said, hey, if people smell burnt toast in their backyard, it relates to this chemical. And that's actually illegal. If you smell that, it means that some company came and dumped a chemical illegally in a public area because they don't have anywhere else. They don't want to pay the processing fees to do it right. So they said, hey, we need to crowdsource more of this information so we can better persecute. We have no data on persecuting these people. We have people that might take the time to call up and say, hey, it smells weird, but we're trying to get the word out. We're trying to use some sort of web mapping platform to collect more accurate data about where these companies are dumping these noxious chemicals. So it was at that point that I realized that as a developer, you have an incredible power to collect data from people, and then because you get these nice data sets, if you open that up and make it available to the people whose job it is to analyze data and make sure that things in a city are working correctly, that's an incredibly rewarding kind of thing. And the project itself was already rewarding because it's funny to know where smelly places are. It's like an inherently interesting data set, and I was blown away that someone had an even like some sort of social justice application to that. It was a pretty cool realization.
Yeah, well, definitely. I know you do quite a lot of. You have to get in a lot of data to clean it and do all of that sort of stuff. I was just wondering if you could give us a little heads up on the tools you use and what you think is really good in that sort of sphere.
Yeah, so I think that there's this architecture where you have a layer of data that might come in and out of your application. So if you're building a real estate search and you need to show people like what neighborhoods, give someone a drop down of the neighborhoods that they could find houses in, you have to go and get that neighborhood data somewhere. So I kind of describe this concept of a data citizen. Like being a good data citizen means you're taking this data from public sources. It's probably some government employee's job to collect the zip code boundaries. And if you take that and you're selling a service on top of it that makes money, you should do the good thing. And if you improve that data set, you should also release it again out the other way so other people can use it. So everybody's making the data better. There's the traditional kind of approach to giving data out, which is a queryable API or an RSS feed, or maybe a CSV download. I'm really pushing for a next generation of data pub/sub, where we could have revision data that is actually subscribable in real time. So the biggest deployment of this, I'm a bit of a CouchDB fanboy. Couch, my favorite feature by far and wide is the ability to synchronize two databases together. And I was describing this the other day as Git for data, or Dropbox for data. Yeah. So you, instead of, having to download a CSV every time the data set uploads, you actually just tell your database you want to subscribe to a remote API. And that is huge for this idea of data citizenship, where data is going to come into my service. People who work at my company are going to clean up the data because it makes our product better. But because it's public data, I can republish it. And then that's kind of the equivalent workflow as GitHub, where someone somewhere is working on an open source project, and they make it open source because they know that the network effects gained from other people getting to look at the code will ultimately make the code work better. But anybody can fork it and go a different direction with the data. And you don't necessarily have to have one ultimate data set to rule them all. You can have forks of data. So I'm trying to kind of playing around with these different ideas and applying them to data from the decentralized version control world. There's a really awesome tool called Google Refine that makes it loads easier to actually do this kind of data processing workflow. And Google, it's a recent acquisition by Google, a company called MetaWeb, and they just had tons of smart people for the last few years trying to solve the problem that I've kind of outlined. They were trying to build this giant fact database. So you could take anything in the world, like television, and then you could get every linked idea to television and kind of like have a semantic reference of the word television and figure out how many televisions there are in the United States, or figure out like what the etymology of the word television is. This crazy database. So they had all these really smart data scientists. And I think that in the world we're in today, kind of politically and economically, open source is more or less of a one battle. Like, people get the merits of open source. There are companies like Red Hat that are making billions of dollars on open source software because they're the smartest developers. It's not about selling the software anymore, it's about selling the service. But I think, like the term big data, Jason Smith from Iris Couch said this yesterday at NodeConf. He said that big data is buzzy now, but in a few years, people will think of big data and they'll say it in kind of a less buzzy way. They'll say, oh man, kind of like Big Brother, like, oh, big data is the reason that everyone knows where I am all the time and I can't get away. It's like people that get sick of cell phones. They'll be saying like, oh, big data is the reason that my wife figured out that I bought her flowers for her birthday before I gave them to her because she saw it on one of her friend's Facebook walls. And like, that we can't get away from the privacy aspect. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting kind of emerging market of data is exploding everywhere and getting collected about everything. And I think that the shift in what we're setting patterns for going forward needs to be focused a lot more on data as opposed to source in the open world.
Yeah. Wow. That's brilliant stuff. Just one last question, which is what sort of things are exciting you apart from big data, more technological things, the actual software and that sort of thing? What things are really exciting you at the moment?
Some of the stuff I'm working for Code for America on is kind of involving trying to get communities of citizens, but also specifically what I'm working on is citizen developers, to care about the kind of world around them. So I've always been a big fan of mapping and mapping technologies. So there's quite a bit of performance increases in the JavaScript world that have allowed for our mobile phones to allow us to load up a map in a web page and edit data and look at data, and everybody has GPS now. A friend of mine has a company called Geoloqui, Geolloqi, and they make a location tracking daemon that runs on your phone all the time. And then if you're walking around, it'll securely share your location with your friends who also have their phones tracking their locations. So it's a private location tracking system, but it's shared with your private network. So if you're walking down Fifth Avenue and I'm walking down Fourth Avenue, we might not run into each other if we don't have our phones turned on. But if we do have our phones turned on, our phones would see that we're about to walk by each other and say, hey, you guys are about to walk by each other. You should go hang out. You know, you don't have anything on your calendar for another 2 hours. So obviously, I'm going to send each of you a text message, and you guys should spend a little time together. Those kind of technologies are really interesting. I'm also really interested in map data collection, and there's a really big renaissance in kind of digital tools as applied to third world crisis scenarios. It started, I think, the Haiti earthquake a few years ago, and the OpenStreetMaps humanitarian team would go down and print out a bunch of paper maps and have people annotate where their shanty town is, and they'd go back and they'd put it into the OpenStreetMaps wiki, and then if Red Cross is trying to fly a helicopter and drop a big load of food somewhere, now they actually know where the highest population density is, because if you look at a Google map, it's just a big gray box. So that kind of like, hey, we need to map our communities, because then not only it helps in emergency scenarios, but it actually just makes maps are this incredible cultural resource. And there's a project called Walking Papers by Mike Migursky, and it's the thing where you can actually print out a map of your neighborhood, go and annotate it, and then you can scan it back into your computer, and your computer knows where on the world that map is, so it can add the things you scanned onto OpenStreetMaps for you. And these kind of like, I'm really interested in equity and accessibility for a lot of these technologies, so I think it's really important that you don't need a smartphone in order to contribute to your data set that you're caring about. There's a really big kind of also push in more efficient collection of things like pothole requests and generally what's called the 311 services. And there's a company that makes smartphone apps so that you can take a photo of a pothole, or you can take a photo of a downed tree, and you can send those in directly, and your city will see them and receive them more efficiently. But it kind of limits it to the population that has smartphones. So over time, the parts of town where nobody has a camera phone, which is getting less and less, camera phones are getting more and more popular, I guess. But there's still, I think, a digital divide there. So one project that I think would be really cool to see in that space is using things like library drop-off boxes or vote ballot boxes or anywhere that you can slide a slip of paper, just distributing a bunch of paper maps and saying, hey, we're trying to collect data on anytime you witness a crime, or anytime you see a pothole, or anytime you see something dangerous, or anytime you're trying to get somewhere in a wheelchair and you can't. Put a sticker on the map and drop it in a box, and then it'll get digitized. So the better that these kind of crazy computer vision programs get, the easier that'll be to make.
Wow. Yeah, well, thanks so much for giving us a great talk and information on open data. Thank you, Max. Yeah.